Hi and welcome to the world of historical recreation under the thumb of the anti-West woke authoritarians. This is a voyage into degradation, bigotry, and a complete disregard for the people, situations, and era they are attempting to represent. Before I begin though, please consider subscribing as that would help me out a whole lot and keep content like this from disappearing off of YouTube. Now, you might think to yourself that I went a bit far with the original description for what is in reality a little program made by Britain's least popular TV channel, but, and this is a big but, it has garnered a lot of media attention. Even commentators from the good old US of A have spoken about it, and it isn't even their history that is being degraded, at least not this time. But we all know that Hollywood will look at this abortion of a program and say to themselves, this is a good idea. Do historical characters really need to be played by people who actually resemble them? Couldn't we do something like The Life and Times of Theodore Roosevelt, but have him played by a black guy, and make his wife Latinx, and his son a Mexican? Or swap Roosevelt for any other white historical figure, and you get the picture. This is a slippery slope, and it will always head in one direction. Don't expect Shaka Zulu, Pele, or Bob Marley to get the same treatment, because it won't happen. This has got about as much to do with talent and equality as the selection of the South African Olympic team did during apartheid. And without further ado, let's get to the review. It opens with some words on the screen telling us that this story is inspired by truth and lies. I think we can safely assume that the truth being the story it's based on, and the lies being their own dishonest casting and unnecessary embellishments to wokerize the plot and events. It then lets us know that this is supposed to be set in England in 1536, and that at this point Anne Boleyn has been queen for 2.5 years and has given birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, yes, that Elizabeth. But Henry VIII is desperate for a son, and Anne has miscarried twice but is currently pregnant with what they hope will be a boy. Now, I would be lying if I didn't say that the first thing I looked at was the diversity of the cast, as that is this series' selling point, and the thing they've raved about most. They also mentioned something about a psychological thriller, but that was just white noise. And you don't have to wait long before you see the first out-of-place faces that belong to a different world than the one in which this series is set, and it is jarring to the senses that we're expecting 16th century England to see instead modern London represented on the screen. The opening scene is a party at which we see Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn enjoying themselves, with courtiers and hangers-on. We have a quick scene of Henry snorting at Anne's statement that their daughter Elizabeth would make a good monarch, and instead talks about their impending hoped-for son and how great a king he will be, which is correct for the times, but you get the impression that the program maker was sneering at Henry being a powerful white man, and the lack of equality he affords to women, even his own daughter. We are then properly introduced to Jodie Turner-Smith as Anne Boleyn, playing cards with her ladies-in-waiting, which is also accurate as Anne Boleyn was known for racking up card gambling debts which Henry paid for, but she comes across as very full of herself and annoying, which seems opposite to the charming, vivacious girl of historical record. Instead, she's the kind of person who, whenever she opens her mouth, is going to be making some snarky little comment and bullying people she knows can't fight back, and she is positively mean to Jane Seymour, who is played by a girl who looks almost prepubescent, rather than the 27-year-old woman she would have been. One of the strange things that you notice about the first episode of this series is that the casting in general wasn't half bad when it comes to the non-diversified cast, with this guy playing Henry VIII, and this guy playing Thomas Cromwell, and, these guys playing whoever they were, which makes it all the more bizarre that they chose to cast Jodie Turner-Smith as Anne Boleyn, and this guy as her brother George. It feels like they got the bare bones of a program together when some sort of major race-related event happened, and they just went nuts and decided to recast some of the main characters to appease the mob. Well, whatever happened, we spend the rest of episode 1 watching Jodie as Anne Boleyn bullying people and acting as though everyone else was something nasty that she just stepped on.
Well then, you really mustn't play.
In a tone of voice that irritates to a degree that, in my expert opinion, explains why Henry VIII went nuts and turned into a tyrant. If I had to put up with that for years, I am sure I would have wanted heads to roll too. Jodie's demeanour aside, my main problem with this episode is that they chose to ignore the historical accuracy of Anne Boleyn's own testament, that it was Henry's jousting accident that caused her miscarriage, in favour of the hearsay that Anne had found Jane Seymour sitting in Henry's lap and flown into a rage which caused the miscarriage. The problem with this choice is that they claim that this is supposed to be a series sympathetic to Anne Boleyn, but they chose to give precedence to a story that originated from her enemies and people that hated her. And let's not forget the weird rapey kiss that they have Anne perform on Jane Seymour, that while obviously not being historical was just extremely uncomfortable, and was yet another example of the bullying nature of this inaccurate representation of Anne Boleyn. Episode 2 opens with Anne sitting on a throne and hearing the whispers at court about her failure to bring the pregnancy to term, and that God does not favour her. She is ruined, and no longer able to have children, etc., etc. But among these whisperings are things like witchcraft, and the lost baby was deformed. Both accusations that were never levelled at her during her life, and that were yet again concoctions dreamt up by her naysayers 50 years after the event. And that is just about all that can be said for the second instalment, as it spends little time on anything in particular, certainly nothing of historical fact, and instead dwells on Anne's apparent mental confusion as to what her position is with Henry after her miscarriage, though it does this in a way that is very heavy-handed and uninteresting. It feels as though they had chosen how the episode should end, but just winged it the rest of the way, as the journey was less important than its ending. One thing this episode does bring to mind, though, is yet again the miscasting and characterization of Anne Boleyn, as we know that Anne was around 5'2" or so, and she would be towered over by Henry VIII, who was apparently 6'2", yet he and all the other men in the episode appear to be of comparable height to Jodie Turner-Smith, and so it kind of diminishes her historically known wit, charm and intelligence, when she seems to be trying to intimidate men with her size. It's a small thing, but it does kind of aggravate you as you watch the series. And again we have the attitude where instead of Anne's vaunted social skills and charming personality, we see her taunting men at court, and generally acting in ways that just don't seem believable for the era that this is set in. Whether this is down to bad scripting or very self-indulgent acting is hard to say, but what I can say is that it is not a joy to watch and does not make you feel sorry for her and her plight. The episode ends with Anne being arrested for treason and other crimes, then being led to a barge to be transported to the Tower to await her trial. Episode 3 begins with Anne arriving at the Tower, and I was very surprised that they didn't show her being taken in through Traitor's Gate, as that is the level, or rather the lack of attention to historical detail, that I've come to expect from this series. But the next scenes show them getting back to what they know best, or don't know as the case may be, since they show Anne being put into what can best be described as a prison hotel room, when in reality Anne was put into the Queen's lodgings, a building that Henry VIII had built specifically for Anne when they were originally married, and so from all accounts was a very lavish, beautiful large building with many rooms and beautiful decorations. It was certainly not a plain room with bars in the windows and walls, with half-constructed ceilings, as we see in the next scene where Anne is made to do her business in a pot. There are apparently no toilets here. It was very hard to watch this retelling of Anne Boleyn in the Tower because they got nothing right, almost nothing whatsoever. Yes, they managed to put a version of her trial in the episode, and yes, they did have her executed by a French swordsman, but that was basically it. I know it must be difficult to find a Tudor hall of that level of magnificence, and in fact there is only one remaining in England, but you could barely fit 50 people in the room they chose. Certainly not close to the 2,000 people who attended the original trial. And I could go on and on about the lack of accuracy, such as witnesses being called, Thomas Cromwell being Anne's accuser, the lack of an apparent jury at the trial, the lack of any audience, Anne not using any of the speeches we know she gave, the fact that this took place in mid-May, but you could see everyone's breath at the execution, and Anne yet again not giving the speech she gave before she was executed, the incorrect people at her execution, the list goes on. But let's remember that this was advertised as telling Anne Boleyn's personal story, which of course they ignored when they chose not to include a single thing she ever said or did, nor did they bother to research the events surrounding her life. This was also advertised as being a psychological thriller, but the people making it were of extremely basic skill level, and their idea of psychological was to have a single scene where Anne was half hearing voices in her head and half the whispering of Henry VIII's court. Basic is possibly even too kind a statement to describe the level of ability shown by the filmmakers. It managed to make one of the most infamous events in English history seem dull and boring. It reached its zenith at the end of the first episode, an episode that took true force of will to even finish watching, as the diversity quotas and blasé don't give a damn about history and racially insensitive casting were at their most notable. To conclude, this is possibly the most egregious bit of filmmaking I have ever seen. Not only does it make a mockery of a proud nation's very important and rightfully celebrated history, it also shows a complete lack of regard for real people, real events and real consequences. This program was written in a bubble, and the only real thing it replicates is the diversity of modern London, and the far-left backward Hollywood-style monoculture that represents only itself within the context of Western civilization, and England in particular. It is about racial and historical appropriation, and the distorting and bending of people's perceptions into allowing for diverse casting, so next time you see Richard III portrayed by a black man, or Elizabeth I portrayed by a black woman, you will react less and less. This is a short step down a slippery slope, and by allowing this historical desecration to continue, we all become guilty of the destruction and vandalism of our great history. This has been Movies Suck, wishing that we are not too late to save our great Western cultures. Leave a like, share, comment and subscribe, and I will catch you guys on the flip side.